Hey, today we're going to go through and build a Spring Boot application using Spring AI 1.0. You'll find that previous information online is a little different than the 1.0 release. This will be using Java 17 and Ollama with Llama 3. So we'll be running this locally. All right, let's have at it. First thing we need to do is take a look at some of the documentation. And we have the Spring AI documentation, .io documentation, and this is in reference to the 1.0-snapshot. So that's the documentation. It's a little bit different than the normal documentation you'll find if you're not looking at the 1.0. So there's an overview of what Spring AI is. There's a getting started section, and it talks about how to build the application or install it and such. It talks about setting up the repositories and enabling the snapshot repositories, and then for the dependencies to make sure we have the 1.0.0-snapshot for the Spring AI for the bill of materials. Okay, so let's take the next step and let's use Spring Initializer to create an application. So I'm going to create a Maven-based application using Java. I'm going to use Spring 3.2.6. Keep in mind you need to use 3.2 or higher, but less than 3.3. So apparently they're still working some of the kinks out, and until they get the official release of 1.0, I don't think it's going to support the 3.3. So for my group, I have com.thomasjconsulting, so reverse domain name. For the artifact, I have SB AI for Spring Boot AI, same thing for the name. Description, I have Spring Boot AI 1.0, Ollama with Llama 3 running local API project. Okay, and I'm going to create a jar, and we're going to use Java 17. Okay, and let's add some dependencies. I'm going to add in web. I'm going to add in Lombok. And of course, I'm going to add in the Spring AI, and I'm going to add in the Ollama. Okay, there we go. So we're going to generate this and download it. All the code will be in my GitHub repository, so you'll have access to it, and I'll attach it to the description. Okay, I'm going to open up the project. I'm going to grab the POM file. I'm going to drop that on top of my IntelliJ. So now I have the project open. Great. It'll go through here and it will load some of the components. Everything looks good. I will close my Spring Initializer. And the rest of the documentation that we have open is just about the configuration, the chat property and such. And you can go take a look at that as time permits. So now that we have the basic application built in Spring Boot, I like to take one step and run the application. So this defaults to the application to run it under Java, the SB AI application. Let's just run that and make sure our initial Spring Boot configuration is correct. Let me enable the Lombok annotations. And we're up and running on port 8080. Okay, so I think we have a good start here. First thing I'm going to do is go through and create a controller. So I'm going to create a new package. I'm going to call it controller. And in that controller, I'm going to create a LLM REST controller. Let's go through and annotate this as a REST controller. And I'm going to go ahead and put in here SLF4J because we want to do some logging in here. And the first thing I'm going to do is set up a request mapping. So our API is going to be at /API/v1/LLM. Okay, and let's just go through and create a simple get mapping. In our basic request mapping, we're just going to call this chat. And I'm just going to create a public string chat endpoint. I'm going to return chatting. There we go. And this will verify that our application's up and running. Let's go ahead and run this, and then we'll run Postman at that endpoint. So let's set up this endpoint as a get, and we get the response chatting. Great. That tells us our URL is set up. But let's change this to a post, since we're going to want to actually send something. And let's say what we want to send to start with is a query string. So we're going to send a request body, and it'll just be a string. And I'll just call it query for now. So I'm just going to echo it right back out. All right, let's start this up. And let's change our get to a post. And for our body, I'm just going to say hello. We get back chatting hello. Great. So one of the next things we should probably have is, rather than just this as a query, let's actually set a model, and let's call this an LLM request. So let's go create a model package. And in here, we'll create an LLM request. And in this LLM request, I'm going to add in at data. This is for Lombok. This will generate our getters and setters. Now I can do private string query. I can then go back to our controller, and I can resolve this dependency. Now I will rename this to LLM request. And then we'll get our query. Now we'll go back to our post, and we'll say this is JSON. And now we have to create a JSON, and we're going to create query. This is the query. All right, let's try that. Great. And this worked as we expected it. Okay, so now that we have a query and we have a response, we can take this next step. We have some configuration that we need to add in here into the application properties. And specifically, since we're going to be using Ollama, we need to add in a couple default properties. Okay, so these are the settings we need for Llama. We need a base URL. So if you're not running this locally, if it's not on the server, or if it's a different port, you can configure that here. This is the model we're going to use. We're going to use Llama3. And this is the temperature. The temperature is between 0 and 1. And what that is how correctly or how distributed the answer is. So a higher number, like a 0.8, 0.9, might be less complete, less repeatable. So I normally use 0.1 or 0.2. Okay, the next thing we're going to do here is we're going to make sure Ollama is actually up and running. So I'm going to open up a terminal window. And in my terminal window, I'm going to verify that Ollama is running. And also I'm going to check what version I'm running. So I'm running 0.1.37. And I want to see what LLMs I have installed. And here I can see I have Llama3, latest. And let me actually run this locally. I can do Ollama run Llama3. And this will run it locally here. And the Llama server has something interesting it does to help you, is it loads everything up in memory when you use it, but if there's no activity for 5 minutes, it frees the memory. So what you could find is if you have no activity for 5 minutes, then you make a call, there'll be a small overhead for loading that model into memory again. Okay, so let me ask it just a standard question here. What do you get when you add blue and yellow? You get green. Great. Okay, so also we can use Ollama as an API. What does this mean? That means I can actually use a curl command and call it. And let's see what that looks like. I'll do a by to close this, and then I will actually post in a curl command and say, what state is San Francisco in? Okay, and we get back the content of San Francisco is located in the state of California. Notice here I sent in the flag of stream false. That's why we got it back very quickly, and for an API, that's how I would use it. Okay, we're done with this. We are sure that Ollama is up and running locally on our system. So let's take it to the next step. We have a REST controller, and we have a query coming in. Let's go through and let's create a service now. So I'm going to create a new package, and it's going to be called service. Within that service, I'm going to create a Ollama LLM service. Create a Java class, Ollama LLM service. Okay. And within that, I will create an annotation of a service. And I'll go ahead and add in here some SLF4J for logging annotations. That's all from Lombok. Okay, now that we have our service here, we can do something in this service, and we can start small. I need to load in a reference to the Ollama chat model. So it appears our POM, we do not have this in here. This is from a newer version. If we go and look at our POM, we'll see that this is using the Spring AI 0.81. And if we read the documentation for the snapshot, we will see that we need to update this. So the first thing I need to do is change that version. And if we're going to use a snapshot, we need to go down and add into the repositories that the reference to the snapshot repositories. So I'll be adding that in here. There we go. So now we can get to the Spring snapshots. So let me select the POM. I'll right click and go down to Maven, reload project. And this will go through and reload new POM. I'll stop the project here. Now if I go back to our Ollama service, now our Ollama chat model. So again, this is one of the new features that's in the 1.0 of the AI versus the 0.81. Okay, so we have that. That's a start. And we can slowly go through. One of the first things that we need to do here is we need to map in through a constructor injection and fill this model. So we can do that as simple as putting this in the constructor. This dot equals that. Okay, so now that's created. So what we're going to do is create a chat in the service. And we're going to make this public string chat. We're going to pass in the query, and we're going to get back a response. So we need to have a response of chat model dot call, and there's a call right here that takes a string, and we'll use that. We just pass in that query, and then we'll return the response. Okay, that should be it. It should be that simple. And let's go over to our REST controller. We need to bring in our service. So again, we'll add a private service, and I'll make this Ollama service. And we'll inject through a constructor so now we can actually call this we're going to call it the chat. We're going to pass on the string. What string are we going to pass in? We're going to pass in the query, and then we'll simply return the response. So let's start this up and let's see what happens. So we're going to go back to our Postman, and we're going to say this query. We're going to ask what day is after Monday. We'll send that. After Monday, the next day would be Tuesday. Great. So we made our call. And we sent in JSON, but we got back to a string. So let's take just a moment here. Let's actually create another model. And we're going to create a LLM response. In here, we will use a @data, and I'm going to create a no-args constructor, and I'm also going to do an all-args constructor, and we'll see what that looks like in just a minute. And so for our response, I'm going to make it very simple. We'll have a status and a response. So let's go to our REST controller. We want to return this now. We're going to actually use a response entity of type response, LLM response. Okay. So what we want to do here is we want to get our chat response. From our LLM interface, and then we want to create the response entity, and we're going to do that using our all-args constructor. We're going to send in success and the chat response, then we're going to return with an OK. All right, so let's restart this and let's try this, and let's see if that cleans us up. Again, we're just kind of incrementally cleaning up our API. Great. So now we send in a JSON payload, and we get back a JSON response. We get the status and the response. Great. Now we have a solid API. So we can add security into it. We could add an API key. You can do all that. I'm not going to spend any time on that, but we have our basic API working now. And at this point, we do in fact have the process making calls in our Llama service. But there's so much more to this. So now that we have the Llama service up and running, let's look at what other things we can do. We have the capability of using a template. And so if we look at our chat, I'm just going to comment this chat out for now. So we have our chat, and let's use a prompt. So we have the concept of a prompt. Where we can import the prompt. And once we have the prompt, we can actually send that in. And we'll see in a minute the reason that we might want to use a prompt. Now, this no longer returns a string, it returns a chat response. And to get that information, we have to get the results. After we get the results, we have to get the output, and then we need to get the content. There we go. So now we're building up on some of the complexity of the chat mechanism in the Spring AI. Now, if you've used any other products like LangChain, you'll notice that, oh yeah, this looks kind of similar. A lot of the information and concepts are the same across the products. So whether you're doing it in Python or you're doing it in Spring AI. Okay, so now we've actually created a prompt and wrapped this query with a prompt. Let's run this and just verify that this in fact still works. Yep, that looks good. Okay, so we have not broken anything. We just have a different way of sending the query in. So that's interesting. And there's not much value of using the prompt if we're not taking, adding any value to that. But there's things that the prompt will do to make it significantly more valuable. So let's go back into the code again, and we'll look at this chat. And again, we'll comment out this chat because this uses the prompt, which is interesting, but it's not what we need to do right now. Let's take a look at another option. And in this, we're using the chat with a query, and we're using something called a chat template. And in here, I can actually give it instructions. Instructions, you are an AI assistant that can answer your questions. If you don't know the answer, don't make suggestions. Just say, I don't know, and instructions. And the question, so we're going to answer questions. Questions is from input. Great. And the question is, where do we get input? Well, now that we have this prompt template, we use a prompt template in our create. And when we create this here, we're going to create a map. So we're using map of. We're taking reference of an input. Remember, we use input here, and we're tying the query to it. So this is very simple. Then the response is the exact same thing we were doing before. So now, if we go through, let's see what this looks like. If we run this, the day after Monday is Tuesday. Great. So with this, we can do a little what's called prompt engineering. And there's a significant amount of prompt engineering that's capable of doing stuff. Now that we can add information into the prompt, we could add some content in here. We can also, importantly, add some history. So for example, if you're chatting back and forth and you want to have a conversation, then you can add the previous information of what the user said and what the system said. And now we have the concept of user messages and system messages. So let's, again, comment out this chat. And let's think of doing something else. What if we could actually have a message, but include some content? Well, if you think of the concept of a RAG, so regenerative application generation. Okay, so I'm creating some content here. Tom is a programmer working for Acme Programming. Tom is underpaid. Bob is a programmer working for Acme Programming. Bob is paid more than Tom. Acme Programming is a consulting company that employs programmers. Okay, so this is my content. And this content could be pulled out of a vector database, other databases. You could do similarity searches, and I'll do other videos and all that stuff in the future. But now, what does our query look like now? Okay, so now that we have our content in here, let's go through and create our chat. So now our chat, we still have a prompt in here. You are an AI assistant that can answer your questions. Use the content provided. Oh, well, that's new. If you don't know the answer, don't suggest it. Just say, I don't know. Now we have content, and we input content as well as a question. So this essentially is a question against this content. We create our prompt template. Now when we create our prompt, we send in the input for this guy. Then we send in the content for this. And remember, we created a little string right here. Okay, so now we're going to ask questions against that content. And let's go through and see what we can do. So I'll show this content so we know. And the first question here, let me open up another window here. Who is Acme Programming? According to the content, Acme Programming is a consulting company that employs programmers. Perfect, exactly what it is. Who is Tom? Tom is a programmer working for Acme Programming. Who are the programmers? According to the content, there are two programmers, Tom and Bob. Notice I did not ask who the programmers are in the world or at Acme. It made that assumption based on the content. Who gets paid more? Bob gets paid more than Tom. So without doing a whole lot of work, this added a significant amount of power. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please comment if you want me to do more videos like this. I'm going to do a full video on RAG using ChromaDB, which allows you to run a vector database locally, which works very well with Ollama. I have another video on Ollama running on a GPU in an AWS instance. I think you'll enjoy that as well. Please like and subscribe to my videos. Let me know if you have any comments. Take a look at my other videos. Thank you. Have a great day.